So it can be argued that the Allied victory in World War II saved what was best in Western civilization while seeming to discredit much of the West. Now, this does not mean, however, that all the questions raised by the war had been answered. If World War II discredited offensive war, how is it not ever since let legitimacy to the notion of defensive war? If it discredited appeasement, have we not been groping ever since to find a diplomatic middle ground between acquiescence and all-out war with the world's dictators? If it discredited fascism, was not the other European political and social extreme, communism, legitimized by Stalin's elevation to the Big Three and victory in the Great Patriotic War? Now, indeed, if authoritarianism, the cult of personality, militarism, uncritical nationalism, and anti-Semitism were discredited in the West, had not all but the last been the means to victory in the East? Now, a great struggle remained in the aftermath of the war, this time between democratic capitalism and communism. Now, this helps explain why some Western commanders, notably American General George S. Patton, urged that the Western Allies not stop at the Elbe, but continue on through Germany and attack the Soviets. That suggestion was not taken seriously, but another general's plan, that of George C. Marshall, for economic assistance to war-torn Europe, can be seen as a subtler way of winning the area for democratic capitalism. Now, as all this implies, within a few years of the war, the victorious alliance, Europe, and the world divided into two opposing camps, fighting a life-and-death struggle with propaganda and materiel, as well as bullets to a sequel to World War II known as the Cold War. Finally, if World War II settled anything, it was that the rise of preeminence of the two great superpowers who would be the principal combatants in the Cold War. Now, obviously, the end of World War II left much unfinished business. Much of Europe, China, and Japan were devastated. Whole cities had been leveled by successive bombing campaigns. Armies of refugees found themselves displaced. Local governments broke down as the defeated regimes crumbled. Now, the Allies turned from occupiers to administrators and judges. Germany was divided into four zones corresponding to the British, the French, the Americans, and the Russians. The highest level of Nazis were put on trial at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. Now, the trials were controversial at the time. Never before had the leaders of a sovereign state been put on trial for their actions while in power. Now, despite objections, it was felt that Nazi crimes were so blatant, heinous, and widespread that the trials were justified. A panel of high-level judges representing all the major victorious powers was named. Prosecution and defense counsel were appointed by the Allies, and in the most famous trials, about 24 high-level Nazis were indicted on October the 18th, 1945, for crimes against humanity, specifically the deliberate instigation of wars, genocide, and the murder, enslavement, and mistreatment of political opponents, religious groups, prisoners of war, and inhabitants of occupied countries. Now, all but Albert Speer, Hitler's munitions minister, pled not guilty, arguing Ordnung ist Ordnung, or that they were just following orders. Most defendants were sentenced to hang, some received prison sentences. Subsequently, 10 other trials were held of about 185 other individuals. Similar trials took place in Japan between 1946 and 1948, which was given a new constitutional monarchy by General Douglas MacArthur. Now, there were numerous other tribunals, often military, in formerly occupied countries, and Nazi war criminals continued to be hunted down to the turn of the 21st century. But many war criminals escaped or were smuggled out of the country, often to South America, where authoritarian regimes found old Nazis congenial and even useful as they established their militaries. Others were denazified by the Western Allies and quietly allowed to resume their lives in Germany. Now, why was this allowed to occur? In the eyes of the Western Allied occupiers, their administrative competence, conservative mindset, and support were needed to run war-torn Germany and prevent it from going communist. Further, high-level Nazi scientists were cherry-picked by other sides in the hope, of giving a boost to their weapons programs. On the other hand, it must be said that under Allied tutelage, the German people did a far better job of confronting their past than have other former Axis countries or their collaborators. Now, in the Western zones, the Allied occupying powers mounted an anti-Nazi propaganda campaign. German citizens were relentlessly taught the evils of Nazism, authoritarianism, and militarism. And beginning with the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, the West German government provided financial aid to Israel and compensation and restitution to Holocaust victims. Now, World War II destroyed the old balance of power. Formerly great empires, especially Britain, were exhausted, leaving two major players, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, following the war, these two great powers began to come into conflict. Marxism-Leninism called for the violent overthrow of capitalist regimes and their replacement by secular communist states. The Americans, the British, and French assumed that the Soviet Union wanted to take the continent. And after the fall of China to communism in 1949, the West felt threatened by two vast communist powers willing to use any means to spread international revolution. Now, from the Soviet point of view, it was the West and Western-style capitalist countries that surrounded the Soviet Union. In the Soviets' view, General George C. Marshall's plan to rebuild Europe, announced in 1947, was an American plot to reduce Western Europe to economic dependence on the United States. Billions in food and reconstruction money poured in. This act was rightly portrayed in the United States as an unprecedented act of generosity. Certainly, that is how it was sold. Now, this act, though, was also part of a politico-economic strategy. American manufacturers looked to revitalize Europe as a market for their goods, and the British and American governments worried that a devastated Europe would be ripe for communist revolution or conquest. Now, the Soviets feared that the Marshall Plan would make Europe into a dependent colony of the American economic empire. Stalin initially tolerated coalition governments and multi-party states in his zone of influence, but cracked down in 1947 through 1948 when Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland expressed interest in participating in the Marshall Plan. Now, Stalin's immediate goal does not seem to have been world domination. Rather, he wanted a buffer of friendly powers against the West. Thus, the Soviets crushed democratic movements in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Now, the key period of mutual misunderstanding and paranoid reaction was 1947 to 1948. In 1947, a conservative Greek monarchy supported by the British was under attack by communist insurgents, and the Americans stepped in with $400 million in aid. But the most important source of tension was Germany. In May of 1947, the United States, Britain, and later France fused their German zones of occupation into an economic union. The Americans, in particular, wanted Western Germany firmly in the American column, as opposed to a non-aligned but united Germany. In May of 1952, Stalin proposed four-power talks about Germany. He wanted to prevent a revitalized Germany from moving into the Western column, and those talks were rejected by the West. In June of 1947, as we've seen, the Americans proposed the European Recovery Program, also known as the Marshall Plan. In February of 1948, the Soviets authorized a communist coup in Czechoslovakia. At this point, the Western Allies signed the Brussels Defense Pact, a precursor to NATO, and the Russians responded by leaving the Allied Control Council for German Affairs in Berlin. In March of 1948, talks began in London, boycotted by the Soviets, to create a West German state. Its formation was announced in June with its own currency. Now, the Allies sought to introduce that currency to Berlin, which was an island within the Soviet Union and the Soviet zone. The Soviets closed off access to the city. Now, the U.S. responded with the Berlin Airlift, which provided 8,000 tons of provisions a day for 324 days. By 1949, the nations of Western Europe had joined the United States in a defensive alliance called NATO, or the North Atlantic Trade Organization. And while those in the Soviet bloc formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Now, spies on both sides infiltrated each other's camps. The British Secret Service was compromised. In the 1950s, a Red Scare swept across the U.S., which was based on evidence that later proved true in part, but was highly exaggerated. Now, Western fears that the vast Red Army would roll across Europe were tempered by the fact that the Americans had a working atomic bomb. Western strategy was to use the bomb, if necessary, to hold back the Red Army. But in 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. By the early 1950s, both sides had developed hydrogen bombs and maintained vast air forces to deliver them to the other side. Now, the British and French also developed nuclear arsenals in the 50s, the Chinese in the 60s. Hold on one second here. Now, by the late 1950s, the bombers were superseded by intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of being launched from land or sea. And then given that any one of these weapons could devastate an entire city, it soon became clear that the use of even one of those weapons would bring an overwhelming response. Thus was born MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. Both sides were fully aware that the use of nuclear weapons would bring annihilation, and the Soviets pledged never to provoke such an attack by a first strike, but the Americans retained first strike capability because they saw this as the only counterweight to the size of the Red Army. In the 60s, President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev agreed to a ban on testing of nuclear weapons, followed by a series of non-proliferation treaties to prevent these weapons from falling into yet more hands. Now, as with the arms race of the late 19th century, both sides spent enormous amounts of national treasure on the building of weapons that they could not use, hence the term Cold War. Now, in fact, the demise of European empires gave the two superpowers the opportunity to fight each other by proxy, as each side tried to convert the world to its way of life. Now, World War II was the death knell for most of great European empires. Now, tied up in Europe, the great European powers had virtually conceded their empires to the enemy. The Japanese, in particular, claimed that theirs was a war to liberate Asia and the Pacific from Western conquerors. The great nations of Europe emerged from the war exhausted, in no position to stand on the way of independence movements. In many cases, European nations had enlisted colonial peoples in the fight against the Axis by promoting to visit the issue of independence. And by educating native elites at such institutions as Oxford, the colonial powers had exposed them to the great intellectual heritage of the West, which emphasized freedom, equality, human rights, and national self-determination. Now, for other natives, communism, with its cry for revolution, seemed a better route to national self-determination. Now, the transition from colony to independence was piecemeal and sometimes violent. It began in 1947 with the withdrawal of Great Britain from India. By the 60s, most British colonies had achieved independence, often peacefully and willingly, participated in a commonwealth united by weak ties to the UK. The French and Dutch tried to hold on to their colonies, leading to bloody insurrections in Vietnam, Algiers, Indonesia, and New Guinea in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. Indonesia achieved full independence from the Dutch in 1949. Now, even where decolonization was accepted by the colonizing country, violence also often broke out among native populations. Old tribal loyalties resurfaced and conflict arose between Democrats and communists. Thus, the two superpowers and China became involved in areas far from home in an attempt to sway the new regimes to one side or the other. The process began in Korea in the early 50s when UN forces opposed a Chinese-backed North Korean invasion of the South. The process continued in the 60s as the United States and Australia took over for the French in opposing a communist movement in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Now, it became American policy to oppose revolution, to oppose nationalist movements, to oppose even democracy where there was a chance that a country might go communist. Now, from the 50s to the 80s, the United States often backed ruthless, murderous dictators as long as they were not communists. Now, similar proxy fights, often backed by the American CIA or the Soviet KGB, were fought all through the 50s and 60s in South America, Africa, and the Middle East. Now, the British and the French failure in the face of US and Soviet opposition to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt in 56 to 57 demonstrated that the days of Western European hegemony were over.